Well, it really does give me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Iain Murray, um, who, according to his CV, which I managed to poach off the web, is a person of many parts. Um, and of course, I sent out quite a lengthy little introduction with the notices, so I won't sort of go over that in any detail. But I could mention that he's got a very long-standing interest in the public understanding of science in general, and the focus of this has been the work of Sir Barnes Wallace, and that goes far beyond, in fact, what we may hear about tonight. Um, I think I mentioned that he also speaks of Barnes Wallace work on the very large bombs like the Tall Boy and the Grand Slam, but also has contributed to quite a number of TV programs, including things like Foyle's War, Dambusters, Building the Bouncing Bomb, Who Do You Think You Are, and Building Hitler's Super Guns. So really, um, he's done a lot of interesting stuff. And one of the things that rather intrigued me is from his actual academic background, where he's taught computing at Dundee for over 25 years. And his main research interest is something very intriguing to me, the inclusion of emotion in synthesized speech and the use of speech in systems for people with disabilities. That's of interest to me because my eldest son's severely disabled in that regard. And he's got more than 30 publications from that type of work. And his current teaching includes computer systems, especially hardware aspects, and also database systems. Perhaps he should have been involved in the great national database proposals, which of course we all know cost about, was it 7 billion and produced nothing? Probably because of poor definition, I suspect. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Ian, who's going to talk about the Highball program, which, as I mentioned briefly, is the mini bouncing bomb. But some of the other inventions and how we got to the big bouncing bomb also will be mentioned in his talk. So over to you, Ian, now.
Okay, David, thanks very much indeed. Good evening, everybody. As David Bradley told me, you are a disparate, eclectic bunch. So as I say, I hope there'll be something for everybody in the talk here. I've given it this subtitle, A Cinderella Story, because as you'll see, I got all of the different bits from lots of different people, and bizarrely there are some robots in it as well, as we'll see. So great, my clicker stopped working. Oh, I'm not selected the right window, have you? There we go. No, that's not it either. Right, great stuff. The computer expert completely fails trying to get to the second slide. Why is this not going? There we are. Right, didn't select the window properly. Okay, so I'll start out with a quick introduction and the reason behind all of this. A little bit of geography just to show you where Loch Striven is and some of the details of it. How and why Highball was developed, how and why it was used, and then a bit about the recovery that we did and where the bombs have actually got to now. So I'll start out with a clip from the Dambusters. So this is, in everybody's mind, the Dambusters bomb, but the Dambusters bomb was never dropped, other than in real life during the raid, on a lake, a loch. So this is actually footage of Highball from Loch Striven, which they did just for the continuity of the movie. So it's so far away you can't really make out any details other than that it is some sort of bouncing bomb, but this is actually a Highball. So I knew from a way back that the clips in the Dambusters were actually Highballs and not really the Dams bombs for that reason. So this is Wallace, and if you know anything about the Dambusters, you will probably have seen some variation of that diagram, which is a cross section of the Mona Dam. And this actually comes, or this version of it comes from the patent document that he put in August 1942. That's nice that he still had time to be putting patents in during the war. One of about 140, I think, that he put in his lifetime. So that shows the bomb skipping over the water and hitting the dam. However, that patent also includes this diagram, which is exactly the same thing, but with respect to a ship. Because Wallace knew that if he might not be able to sell his idea to the RAF, but he could try selling it to the Navy as well. And indeed, he did initially have more success with the Navy. So the idea of attacking ships with the bouncing bomb was in right from the start. The dam's bomb was called Upkeep. That's it on the left. It was very heavy, about 4 tons, 9,250 pounds. It was incredibly simple fabrication-wise. It was 2 metal plates and a bit of rolled steel, bolted or riveted together with a flange to actually carry it. He wanted it to be spherical because he thought that would have better properties traveling through the air and also skipping over the water. So initially they put wooden staves around the drum like a barrel. They had straps around it to hold the staves on. But as you know from the Dambusters film, what happened when they dropped this was that the straps would break when it contacted the water and all of the staves would fly off. But on some of the trials, the cylinder kept on bouncing on its own. So actually the bouncing properties of the cylinder were actually fine. So they ended up with the dam's bomb just being the plain cylinder without the external casing on it. Highball was exactly the same in form. It was smaller with a 600-pound charge, which is more than a torpedo. So if it struck, it would have more effect than a torpedo. About 3 feet in diameter, and the shell in this case, they had enough. The shell was small enough that they could make a spherical steel shell to go around the padding on the outside, and that was actually strong enough to stay on in the smaller size. So the Highball stayed spherical, whereas the Upkeep was cylindrical, and it was about 1,200 pounds altogether. So that was light enough that you could actually carry 2 of them in a Mosquito. So the bomb bay had this special fairing added to it, and inside there was a special cradle which carried the 2 bombs. It was driven by a hydraulic motor to spin the bombs up, and the wheels on the end of the bomb parted to let the bombs drop out. You could drop them singly, or you could drop both of them together. They actually dropped a fraction of a second apart so that they didn't contact one another after they had dropped. So this is how it works, as we've already hinted to. So it travels over the water in a skipping motion like this. It's initially traveling at the speed of the aircraft, so it's not slowed down as much as a torpedo, so it will get to the target much quicker, so there's less time for the target to get out of the way. And if your target is stationary, then they have probably put anti-torpedo nets around it, and a torpedo would obviously get caught in those, but the Highball will skip over them. Once it actually touches the side of the ship, the spinning motion which has been imparted to it means that if it bounces back a little bit off the side of the ship, the spin will, as it falls through the water, the spin will press the bomb against the side of the ship, as it did on the dam's bomb as well. So the backspin keeps it pressed towards the ship. Once it falls underneath the ship, it will travel forward, so it will detonate underneath the ship where there's no armor, of course, make a big hole in the bottom and hopefully sink the ship. So it's got a bigger charge than a torpedo. It blows up at the non-armored part of the ship, so you're much more likely to get considerably more damage. So that was the idea of it. The reason that I was interested in acquiring one was that nobody had one. There are some prototype versions of the golf mine, as the bouncing bomb was called initially. There are some bits of Upkeep, most of which were recovered from the Reculver tests in Kent. There is a number of complete Upkeeps around, including one at Brooklands. There's one at Brenzett in Kent, which has its depth charge pistols in it. There are some Highball cylinders around, so just the internal bit. Some of these are incorrectly labeled as being the Dams bombs, but you can tell from the size that they are actually Highball. Even the one in the museum at Scampton is actually shown as as being an Upkeep. They do have an Upkeep outside the hangar at Scampton now, which I think is a replica. I don't think it's a real one, but they have one inside the museum, which is actually a Highball. And there's a bit of a casing at an airport in Wales, because they dropped some of the Highballs into a railway tunnel in Wales as a test to see if they could damage tunnels by rolling Highballs in, and one of the bits was recovered and is at the airport, but nobody has a complete spherical Highball anywhere. So that was really my motivation behind trying to get hold of one. So this is one of the many test drops at Reculver. That's Margate Pier, you can see over in the distance on the right hand side. And there were many drops of both Upkeep and Highball made at Reculver. After the Dams raid, possibly even slightly before, they decided to move away from Reculver and move to Loch Striven. And this is where it is. So here's central Scotland, and just left of centre there, I've marked in red the loch. So it's only about 35 miles from the centre of Glasgow. It's just off the Firth of Clyde, which of course during the war was a major shipping activity going on there. But despite that, it was a secret location because it's hemmed in by hills, and it's really quite isolated. There's very few houses around the loch, so it was a good place for doing some secret testing. Also of relevance is RAF Turnberry down there at the bottom of the map. That's where the Mosquitoes that were doing the drop tests flew from, and the site is now a golf course owned, of course, by one of the former US presidents, the orange one, if you are not sure which one. So if I zoom in on that area of the map there, so the main part of the bend in the Clyde, what's known as the tail of the bank, was an anchorage, and they had put a boom across between Dunoon and Clough Point to keep the U-boats out. So there would have been lots and lots of naval activity north of that boom on the river. On the island of Bute, down in the bottom left-hand corner there, there was HMS Varbell, which was a former hotel, but it was taken over by the midget submarine people. So they were based in the former hotel there, and they sailed their midget submarines out of the bay that you see there, and they sailed up Loch Striven and did their testing of the midget submarines up in the loch. So it was already in use by the midget submarines. Also up at the top of the loch, there was the very cleverly named HMS Varbell II, which was another big house, and that they had some activity going on up there as well. Most of the activity was in the one on Butte. I'll get this right. Marine Aircraft Experimental Establishment was at Helensburgh. That was at Folkestone, not Folkestone, Felixstowe during the interwar period. But at the start of the war, they thought that Felixstowe was a little bit too close to the enemy, so they shut up shop and moved to Helensburgh. So it was testing all of the flying boats, including the Sunderlands that were made at Dumbarton, which is just out the right-hand side of the map, and did other testing of maritime-related aircraft there. So they had photographers, and they borrowed their photographers to film the tests in Loch Striven that were happening. So the only fly in the secrecy of Loch Striven is the town of Rossi, which is down at the bottom of the map there on Butte, because from Rossi you can see straight up into the mouth of Loch Striven, and indeed most of the way up there. So Rossi would have been quite busy as well. So what they did to try and get round that was that they had some smoke laying devices at the mouth of the loch, and when they were doing the tests, they could fire these up and create a cloud of smoke across the front of the loch, so that the nosy people in Rossi with binoculars couldn't actually see what was going on. And you can see these clouds of smoke in some of the test films as well. One other location, which I will mention right in the top right-hand corner of the map, is the naval base at Faslane, where our nuclear deterrent is now. That is also the home of the Northern Diving Group, who are an explosive ordnance disposal team, and they will come into our story later on. So let's zoom in on Loch Striven itself, just in the centre of the loch there. And this is a map from 1943 from one of the archive papers in the National Archive. And you can see, although it's really just a dot, a mosquito and a series of buoys up the middle of the loch there. And there is a ship which is codenamed BV7. It was actually a redundant French battleship, which was towed into the loch in May of 1943 to use as a target both for Highball and the midget submarines. If we zoom in further on that one, from that diagram and also from all of the footage that we've got a very good idea of precisely where the ship was. One of the things that they were very interested in finding out was how well the bombs stood up to the impact. So they hung nets underneath the ship so that the high balls that struck the ship would fall into the nets, and then the guys in the big heavy diving suit with the brass helmet could go down into the nets and bring the bombs out. However, they were sufficiently unpredictable that they lost most of them, and the loch was so deep there that these guys with the brass helmets couldn't go down and retrieve them from the bottom because the loch was too deep. So what they did was, for most of the tests, they actually moved the ship up to there. There was a pier, a small pier at that location, we believe, because we can see it in some of the films. It's just at the mouth of what is now I think it was then too, the Glen Striven estate. That's the end of the public road, and that was the water under the ship there is only about 100 feet deep. So that location there was our primary destination for actually looking for some of the high balls. So this is a simulator, a Microsoft Flight Simulator with Pucka Mosquito. That's the correct bomb site there inside the Mosquito. I was quite delighted to see. I didn't produce this, but I was delighted to see it. So you'd be flying up the loch, guided by eye, about 50 feet. These buoys were at particular distances, the pilot could then judge the distance to the target and then would fly up over the ship as the bomb skipped down the loch. The plane itself would bank around, hop over that hill there into Loch Ridden, which is the next loch, turn 90 degrees to the left and fly back down to Turnberry again. The thing that you can see on the far shore on the bottom there, that is actually Trustan, that house that was marked on the map. So we've got a good idea of the locations. So this is again one of the many archive films. So this is filmed from the west side of the loch. So this is genuine footage at 100% real speed. I think you can see the buoys in the loch. That ship was used to have mount a camera on, and there is the French battleship. And that's a perfect drop, just coming to rest as it hits the side of the ship. If you were very quick, you would have seen wooden beams sticking out of the side of the ship. They were there to hang the nets on underneath the ship. So there are many archive shots like this. That's one of the better ones. So 617 Squadron are, of course, the famous Dambusters, and 618 Squadron were formed at the same time. They got some coastal command crews, they got some bowfighter crews, and they were practicing to actually drop the Highball against their primary target, which was the Tirpitz at the bottom of the screen there, as indeed the midget submarines. That was their primary target as well. It was hidden in the Norwegian fjords, ready to pop out at a moment's notice to attack our Arctic convoys, which is why Churchill really wanted to get rid of it very seriously. By the middle of 1943, the midget submarines were performing well, and Highball was still a little bit erratic. They had got it to an operational standard, but the main factor in favor of the midget submarines was that the naughty Germans had the ship parallel to the fjord that it was in. It wasn't conveniently at 90 degrees like the target ship in Loch Striven was. So it would have been very difficult for the mosquitoes to actually attack the ship side on. In fact, it would be almost impossible because the hills on either side of the fjord were very steep. So the X-craft got the nod to go and do the attack, and they successfully dropped some charges under the Tirpitz and blew some holes in the bottom of it in September 1943. Most of 618 Squadron were stood down. Some of them went to Cornwall, and their mosquitoes were fitted with 6-pounder guns, which a detachment of 618 used quite successfully against surfaced U-boats in the English Channel and the Bay of Biscay. And then in 1944, we decided that we would try Highball against the Japanese. So 618 was brought back up to strength again, about 25 crews. They were trained to land on aircraft carriers, during which they broke a large number of aircraft, to be fair. Eric Brown, the famous test pilot, you will be aware that he was the first person to land a mosquito and take off a mosquito from an aircraft carrier. That was as part of this operation to show that it could be done. They loaded up all of the mosquitoes in October 1944 onto these two small escort carriers, not for fighting purposes, purely for transport purposes, and they popped off to Australia. They arrived in Australia on the last day of 1944. They did some more test flying from an airfield in Australia, but it was decided in the middle of 1945, even before the war was ended, that they wouldn't be used. The reasons for that are not totally clear. There are a number of theories for that. The squadron was disbanded and the highballs were all piled together and blown up. So that was the end of all of the live ones. So I come into the story about 2007, 2008, when I was preparing this book about Barnes-Wallis. And one of the things which I particularly wanted to cover in that book was a list of all of the test drops of all of his different weapons. Because these are in various archive documents all over the place, but there was no sort of coherent list. And I tried to pull all of these together. When I brought that list together, I realized that I had absolutely solid archive documentary proof that at least 120 highballs were dropped in the loch. I also had pretty good evidence for about 80 more, and I'm pretty sure that that 80 doesn't include the practice. These are all the test drops. The practice drops for the 618 crews were additional. They were supposed to get 2 practice drops each. So that was another 50 highballs as well. So they should have been lined around on the bottom of the loch like sweeties, as we would say up here. I also have documentary proof that no live weapons were tested in the loch at any time. So that was nice to have. It meant that we didn't have to sort out the dangerous ones from the dummies. And as I've already mentioned, a lot of them had been too difficult to recover. So some of them would have been recovered, but not all of them. So they should still be there. And because nobody actually had one, I thought, ooh, let's see if we could actually have a crack at getting one out of the loch to put in a museum. I was particularly interested in giving one to Brooklands because they've got one of all of Wallace's bombs except a highball. So that would complete their collection. So I had to get myself some divers, of course, because I don't dive, I barely swim. And fortunately, part of Dundee University is an art college, and one of their lines of expertise is in recreating 3-dimensional models from sonar data. So this is actually one of the German ships that was scuttled in Scapa Flow. They have done the Royal Oak, they've done several of the other Scapa Flow ships. They've imaged the Royal Oak in Scapa Flow. They were called in to image the car ferry, which sank in Korea, and various other things. So I contacted them, and one of their students was actually just learning how to dive, but was interested in making underwater films, and had done some as part of her training. And they also put me in touch with an underwater archaeology company. So I had myself at least 2 divers, but we needed to get some money in order to fund the whole thing. So this is where the story takes a rather unusual turn, I suppose. This is the view from Rossi. So this is from the promenade at Rossi, looking north straight up Loch Striven. And what you can see in the centre of the shot there is a sort of white thing sitting on the water. So what happened was after the economic downturn in 2008, Maersk, the container shipping line, decided to lay up 6 of their big container ships, and Clydeport offered them the facilities of Loch Striven. So 6 of these huge ships arrived and rafted together in the centre of the loch. And that's looking the other way, a little bit closer. So Maersk had, I think, been told by Clydeport, Loch Striven's pretty deserted, just shove them up there, give us the cash, everything will be fine. But quite a lot of the locals were not particularly happy about this. and created a bit of a stooshy, as we would say. And Maersk were kind of appalled. They were really sort of disappointed that Clydeport had not told them about all these people who actually lived around the place. And they did a massive befriending campaign. I think every school child within 10 miles of Loch Striven was taken out and shown around the ships, given lunch, and just sort of trying to calm the whole situation down. But Maersk were sort of keen to get out of there as quickly as they could. Now the story gets really, really weird. This is a clip from the BBC TV series Mission 2110. You probably missed this one, but in the year 2110, the world has been taken over by robots, and there is only one human left. But fortunately, he has a time machine, and what he can do is to bring children forward from the year 2010, and help him to try and capture the power capsule things that are powering the robots, so that he can defeat the robots. And for reasons which entirely elude me, the setting for all of this was the robots' base, which bizarrely looks like 6 large container ships moored in a Scottish loch. I hope you get the sound with this. We'll try it.
Welcome to Futuregate, the enemy's stronghold and the last battleground for the future of humankind. Humanity's cybernetic servants that have all but wiped us out. Let's hope this works. Here we go!
So if we ignore the creepy aspect of the fact that he's abducting children from 100 years ago, and they then play sort of Crystal Maze type games to recover the power capsules and defeat the robots. So the BBC paid Maersk £30,000 for the use of the ships as a filming location, and Maersk did not want to profit from this, so they wanted to give it away to local charities, and they held an online, not quite an auction, but a vote, I suppose, to distribute this cash amongst potential worthies. I think the winner of that poll was the Rossi pipe band, but actually my submission came second. So Maersk invited us out to the ships. We got a trip from Dunoon round there, and we were on the bridge of one of the ships, got a lovely lunch. That's the captain there, and that's all of the prize winners. I'm in there somewhere. You get a prize if you can spot me. And I got a cheque for £1,200 to fund a preliminary dive to see if we could find anything in the loch, and I sailed away with the £1,200. So very quickly we got set up to do a preliminary dive. This was in 2010. The day before we were due to actually meet, the 3 of us at the loch, I got a phone call from the owner of this fishing boat, and he had seen the publicity for the Mersk event, and he said, "The bombs are definitely there." I said, "How did you know?" He said, "Well, every now and again one of us fishes one up in the nets." I said, "Great, what do you do with them?" He said, "Oh, we take them over to the deep bit of the loch and we drop them in there because there aren't any fish in there. So we don't fish that bit." I thought, great, right. So some of them have actually been moved from where they actually were originally. He's actually had one literally hanging off the back of that boat, almost to the extent that it was about to drown the stern of his boat. But he threw it back. So one thing which he did do was that he very kindly offered us the use of his fishing boat as a dive support vessel, I suppose you would say. My 2 divers here were planning just on walking in off the beach, but we went out in the boat and they went in off the boat, and they swam about 100 meters or so on the bottom, really just to test the water conditions, but with the hope that we would find one. We now know that if they'd swum the 100 meters the other way, they would have found one, but such is life. That's the lodge at the entrance to the Glenstriven estate that you can see in the background there. So the diving conditions were fine. My archaeology diving man had some diving friends, and a couple of months later, they all got together. They hired the fishing boat again, and he had some obstructions marked on his charts, and from his echo sounder, you can see there's an absolutely lovely semicircular thing sticking up from the bottom on his echo sounder image there. So we sailed around looking for these. He had them marked on his charts. We tried to find them, and then the divers would dive down. And on the first one, they found that it was a big stone about the size of a highball. So they came back up again. And we found another one, and they dived down and they found that it was a big stone about the size of a highball. So they came back up again. And this happened, I think, 3 or 4 times. On one of the dives, they did find one of the side charges from an X-craft, interestingly enough, but they didn't find a highball. So they were getting fed up going up and down, wasting all their gas and underwater time. So the next day, we got the loan of this underwater vehicle from the diving school at Dunoon, which is just on the other side of that hill there, with the idea that we would get this device to go and explore these things on the bottom. Almost immediately, this device found a very large anchor with some exceptionally large chain attached to it, the sort of thing that you would anchor a battleship with. And we followed the chain with the robot and we found a highball. And then about 10 seconds later, we found another highball, and then another one, and then another one. So they were all lined up along this piece of chain. And that's the video from the underwater vehicle with the image on there. I think I've got a video clip. Yeah, so the divers now knew where they were. So popped the suits on and down they went. There's the big anchor chain there. So that's the second highball there. This is speeded up a little bit. And one sitting on its side rather than its end. You can still see some of the white paint on that one. And there's a little lobster sticking out of the top of that one, just the sort of thing that the fishermen would have liked to catch. So we now knew where they were and that they were in hopefully a recoverable condition. So we now tried to get a recovery together, and for a long time, precisely this happened. Absolutely nothing at all. Unfortunately, my diving archaeology man's company went bust, and I was trying to get permission from the various people you need to get permission from. I discovered that the RAF has a policy and a form that you can fill in if you want to recover aircraft wreckage, perhaps from a hillside or whatever, but they don't actually have a procedure or a form for something which they dropped deliberately, which is different legally. So they were struggling a bit with that. You also have to get permission from the Crown because they own the seabed and various other people, etc. But then in 2016, I was contacted by the chap on the right-hand side of this picture, whose name is Mark Paisley, and he was a former Tornado pilot. You've probably heard of John Nichol and John Peters, who wrote tornado down. They were shot down in the first Gulf War. Mark Paisley was flying the Tornado immediately behind them. But he didn't get shot down, so he's a lot less famous. He got very interested in diving. He's now a fully qualified diving instructor, and he came to visit me because he'd heard about this project, and he wanted to set it up and recover a couple of them. So gave him all the information. He put the whole team together, did all the paperwork, filled out all the forms, brought the boats, the petrol, the vehicles, everything. So I didn't really have to do anything at all. A couple of the guys from the original dive are in the team of people that you see there. They all paid their own way to actually contribute to this. So we didn't do any fundraising or anything, although we probably could have got lottery funding or something to do it, but they did it just for the experience. So everything was ready to go for July 2017. I then got a call from the Northern Diving Group at Paz Lane, because I'd been in touch with them and I'd said, would really be interested in getting some highballs out of Loch Striven. You're the guys who deal with explosive ordnance. This would be a great training exercise for you. Any chance that you could do that? And they'd initially not replied, but then they did, and they said we would go and have a look, and then I never heard from them for about 18 months. And then in May of 2017, they said, the chap phoned me up and he said, jackpot, we had divers on your highballs today. When would you like one? Where do you want it delivered? And I thought, oh crumbs, right. I've got this team is all lined up and ready to go, and the Navy are going to steal their thunder. So I did the only thing which was practical, which was to put them in touch with one another. And
okay, we can just
turned out that worked perfectly well, because both teams got exactly the thing which they wanted. They got their explosive ordnance experience. These guys got to dive on it as well, do what they wanted. The other great thing was that the Navy brought along a proper diving support vessel, which had a 10-ton crane on it, so it was able to bring the bomb straight up from the bottom. This team was going to use airbags and tow them with the inflatable boats there to the slipway and then bring them out at the slipway. But if you've got a crane, then so much the better. So this is the view from the bridge of the diving vessel as the first one came up. There again is the lodge over on the left-hand side there. So they put a framework around it to hold the strapping in place. I think they tried one just with the strapping and the strapping came off. This bit fell off, and I thought that was part of the casing, but it was just some of the gunge that was stuck to the outside of the bomb. And once we got it in the tank of water, we got the hammer and chisel out, and we chiseled most of the rest of the gunge off it while it was sitting in the tank. So that's it sitting on one end there. So that's once we've cleaned the excuse me, once we've cleaned the gunge off, that's it sitting in the water tank. We would fill this back up with seawater again. That's me explaining some of the history to the leader of the Northern Diving Group team, Tony Hampshire, on the left-hand side there. And that's some of the guys from the team handing over the second one that was recovered actually to the Mosquito Museum in Hertfordshire. So that's their curator taking delivery of it there. And that was it when it was sitting in its tank, when only some of the gunge had been removed from the outside. The other one, which I had wanted to, as I said, give to Brooklands, they took it down to the Mary Rose Trust in Portsmouth, because the Mary Rose Trust are good at dealing with stuff that's been in water for a long time. So they knew the right chemicals to put in to remove all of the salt water, etc., from the bomb. So that's it sitting in the tank in the Mary. That's a bit of the Mary Rose in the tank on the left-hand side there. And once they had done the appropriate length of time in the chemicals, they took it out, dried it off, and gave it a coat of varnish to stop it rusting, and that's it, ready to deliver back to Brooklands Museum. That picture has become transparent for some reason. That's very bizarre. That's a picture of me in rubber gloves. I was invited down there for a TV program to describe the bomb, and they asked me to put blue gloves on before I touched the thing. I didn't like to say that I'd been hitting it with a hammer and chisel a few months previously, but don't know why that picture has not come up. And then this is video from one of the transport guys that Brooklands got in to pick it up from Portsmouth and take it to Brooklands. So you see the Grand Slam on the right there. There's the Upkeep on the left, and in the middle of the picture there, and that's the Highball placed alongside its big brother with all of the other Barnes Wallace bombs. So they had all of those ones, and they now have a Highball as well, and my work here was done. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that was interesting. These are 3 books which I've written, which are available from various sources if you're interested in any more about those particular things. So thanks very much, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
I have a question.
Hi.
Hi, David Hudson. The bombs that were dropped, I assume, would be hollow, would they? They wouldn't have any compensating weight to make up for the lack of charge in them.
They were filled with a mixture of concrete and cork, which was of the same density as the explosive. The space between the cylinder and the spherical shell, they tried, what they needed was some sort of shock absorber so that if it hit the side of the ship, it wouldn't flatten, because that would stop it spinning, but not give it too much of a bounce. So they padded that space with initially wood. They tried compressed paper, and they also used a sort of an aerated plastic resin, very like aero chocolate. The one that that's at Brooklands, no, the one that's at the Mosquito Museum has the bubbled plastic in it. There's a little port in the side that you can see the aero inside. The one at Brooklands has the paper filling. I think it was very difficult to see, but it didn't have a filler on it for the resin. I think it was the paper that was in that one.
No, thank you.
Alan's got his hand up. Alan, do you want to ask yours? Alan, you're still on mute.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mike. Very interesting, Ian. Just a very basic question. Where did the description and name Highball come from and originate, please?
My understanding is that all of the weapons got code names from a list. They had a sort of pre-prepared list of random words, and whenever you phoned up the ministry and said, we've got a new secret weapon, you got the next name off the list. In the case of Highball and Upkeep, I cannot believe that was the case, because they're too similar. initially, the names were actually secret as well. The group that David Bradley and myself are in, we had a talk about 15 years ago from one of Wallace's draftsmen, and he said he was working on he had the plans of the upkeep on his drawing board, and there was a phone call for him, and there was a voice on the phone said, "Do you know anything about upkeep?" And he said no, because he'd never heard the word before. And the chap said, "Okay, thank you," and he hung up. So he was actually drawing the plans of the bomb, and he didn't know the code word for it. But all of the archive paper, and initially it was the golf mine, and then it sort of split into the upkeep and Highball for the naval or the anti-ship version. But I don't know. Some person at the ministry would have picked the names. I don't know exactly the process, but as I say, it clearly wasn't random in this case.
Thank you, Ian.
Adrian's just asked a question on chat. Adrian, do you want to come off mute and ask it direct? I see Roger's got his hand up as well.
Yeah.
You're still on mute.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, it's Rory.
Yeah. So I actually wrote my dissertation on 617 Squadron attacking the rear dams and Operation Chastise. So, of course, even though it's a fairly small squadron and they suffered very high casualties attacking, they were still very successful. But do you think 618 would have suffered exactly the same casualties attacking the ships? Because, of course, they're fairly heavily protected with flat guns and turrets and turrets are quite heavy flak batteries around it with smoke screens. So do you think they would have suffered the same casualties that 617 Squadron did?
Very difficult to say. I suppose that the dams had, or one of the dams had some guns, which shot down one of the aircraft. Most of the planes that were lost on the dams raid were lost due to the low flying.
Yeah.
As you'll know, because two of them flew into pylons, one of them flew too low and got the bomb ripped off by the sea. So none of them were directly brought down by the weapon itself.
No.
So the weapon, I suppose, wasn't a problem, and indeed, in all of the, I mean, they must have done hundreds of drops of Highball during the war, and as far as I'm aware, no mosquito was actually damaged in that process. They did actually lose one after the war. They were doing rough water testing off the west coast of Scotland, and one of the Highballs hit a wave and threw up a big wash of water that knocked off one of the stabilizers on the mosquito, and it crashed. And of course, the Americans, they had it for 2 days and managed to crash the airplane with it. So yeah, it wouldn't have been down to the weapon. It would have been down to how much anti-aircraft fire there was, I suppose. So the advantage of Highball was that you could drop Highball further away than a torpedo, and turn around and fly away. So it would have been, it should have been more a bigger aircraft, I suppose, but it should have been more survivable than a torpedo attack.
I also presume they would have been unarmed. Like they would have been the bomber version with the glazed nose rather than the armed version.
Yeah, it would certainly have had the glazed nose. Yeah, and the navigator sat beside the pilot. He wasn't actually in the nose. In the simulation video that I had there, the sight is sort of in the cockpit window.
Ian, do you happen to know what the release distance was from target?
It was about 1,400 yards.
Yeah, still quite close actually in terms of turning radius for turning away from a target. And of course you go belly up to turn away. So you're very exposed at that stage.
I spoke to John Moffat, the guy who's credited with the torpedo hit on the Bismarck, and he said that when they turned away from that, he actually did the turn entirely with the rudders. He kept the plane flat so that he wasn't exposing the belly of the plane to the ship. I don't know if you could have done that in a Mosquito at 250 miles an hour. But
it's a bit unlikely, I suspect. Yeah, you would get some side skid, but you can do all kinds of clever things like asymmetric power to help with that. But at the end of the day, you're a big target going straight towards anti-aircraft guns.
So there are three more questions. I saw Roger had his hand up. I can see Bernard's got his hand up, and then there's another question on chat from Stuart. So Roger, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'll do that. Fine. It was just being such an interesting weapons, Highball. Was there any thought of giving it any further development? I appreciate one of the things that they had to cancel an operation was the fact that the Highball you had to go straight. Was there any thought or in trying to introduce a capacity for it to perhaps have a parabolic trajectory, or at least it could turn through 45 degrees or whatever to allow a more effective attack? I just wondered whether once somebody designed it, whether you could introduce a form of counterbalancing that would make it track a curved course or anything like that. Thank you.
I'm not aware of anything like that in terms of it not following a straight course. There is some footage of drops in the bombing range at the New Forest where they were dropping them over land, hitting buildings. If you see the film Mosquito Squadron with David McCallum, which is it's kind of like 633 Squadron. It's a sort of fictitious thing, but it's actually got Highball, and again, like the Dambusters, it's got the real archive footage of the Highballs going over land. They did the test in Wales, trying to go into railway tunnels, which would have probably worked as well. The developments after the war, they did actually continue to refine it, and they ended up with a magnesium case rather than a steel one. So they sort of, I think they electrically welded the two magnesium shells together, and they cut. I don't know why they got rid of the hydraulic spinning, but the magnesium one actually had little cups cut into the shell, and then they just simply had an air scoop that directed the airflow onto the outside of the bomb, and it sort of caught in these cups and made it spin just with the air going past. I don't know why that was better than just spinning it hydraulically or whatever, or electrically even, but
I suppose it could be increased airspeed. You get about 500 mile an hour by about 48, 49, wouldn't it?
And it was, they tested it on Sea Hornets, Grumman Avengers, which just didn't fly fast enough. I think the Mosquito, the rig in the Mosquito was sort of built into the Mosquito, but they developed a sort of removable one so that you could take a sort of standard bomber Mosquito or a Sea Hornet or whatever, and then this thing would just fit into the bomb bay like a bomb carrier. So if you wanted to go back to being a regular bomber, you just took that thing back out again.
Was there ever any evidence of the weapon being used for real? I mean, you've talked lots about trials, but were there any operational uses of the weapon?
There is some evidence, yes. The squadron was based at Skitton, which is north of Wick, and they were based there because if they were going to the Tirpitz, that's where they would probably have flown from. And there is an archive document that says that they did actually fly with live Highballs on patrol from Skitton, with the purpose that if they saw a U-boat on the surface, they would dive down and try and attack the U-boat with it. But somebody at the ministry took cold feet and thought, U-boat's very low in the water, you're very unlikely to hit it. And if there's somebody on the bridge of the U-boat and they see this, that's given the technique away. So they then withdrew that again. But there is a document which I have from the archive which says that 618 did actually fly with live highballs at one point, but it was for a very short period of time.
You'd have thought the Germans would have clocked after they lost a couple of dams, wouldn't you? That the principle was still there.
Yeah, of course, they had recovered one, so they had worked it all out from that, and they had their own. Of course, they had eventually they had a highball equivalent.
The next question from Bernard.
It would seem that in all the trials, the highballs used were dummies. Were they in the trials? Were they ever used actual live bombs, or were they all just dummies?
There is footage of a live Upkeep being dropped as a test. I am not aware of any live highballs ever being dropped, and certainly I have a document which states that there were no live highballs dropped in Loch Striven. Some of the highballs were, the center of the cylinder had a tube in it, and you put a depth charge pistol in one end and you put a self-destruct fuse in the other end in case the pistol didn't go off. Some of the highballs were dropped with the depth charge pistol in because they wanted to be sure that all of the bouncing and the hitting of the ship didn't disable the pistol. So when the pistol fires, well, the pistol you would have a detonator and there's a spring-loaded pointer. So when the depth charge pistol gets to the right depth, this is released and it shoots forward and fires the detonator. So the release of that makes a click. So one of this is brilliant. They needed to track the underwater path of the bomb to make sure that it did go under the ship. So some of the bombs had the pistol, some of the bombs had a clicker attached to them that made a noise, and they put about half a dozen, maybe actually more than that, hydrophones down at various depths around the ship. And then that was attached to one of these bar chart pen recorders. And from that, they could work out where each, because you had different distances to all the hydrophones, you could work out the three-dimensional position of the bomb for each click. And when they were testing the pistols, they would use the hydrophones and they just listened for the click that said that the pistol had fired. I got very, very excited this week because I got contacted by the chap at the Mosquito Museum who's in charge of setting up their highball. They've now got it out the tank and dried off. And when it was taken out the water, it was sitting on one end. It was put in the tank on that way up. It was delivered to them that way up. And they took it out the tank and turned it over. And it's one of the ones that's got the pistol in the end. So he said once we cleaned the gunge off, there was this beautiful shiny brass thing, and we undid the screws and took it out, and it had fired. And I just found that out this week. But there must have been a very small proportion of them that were dropped with a pistol, so they hit the jackpot with that one.
Final question: what happened to the French battleship?
It got in summer of 44, it got towed away to Normandy, and it was sunk as part of the breakwater for one of the Mulberry harbours. There were about 6 ships, the Sumatra, can't remember the other ones. There was about half a dozen, and they were sort of positioned around the harbour and sunk down onto the sand. The fascinating thing is that while it was there, the Germans sent out some midget submarines that were equipped with torpedoes, and because the ship hadn't sunk completely, because you wanted it still above the water because it was a breakwater, the German midget submarine identified it as a battleship and fired its torpedo at it. So it is my belief that the French battleship is the only ship to have been attacked by secret midget submarines of both sides in the Second World War.
So Stuart asked a question as well. You've got it on chat. Do you want to read it out?
Sure. It's Ian Adams. So my son's been using the computer, hence the sudden change on that. No, you weren't to know that. Two short questions, actually. Did they train for a nighttime delivery of the weapon, like the Lancasters went in at night? And secondly, is there any archive movie of a Mozzie dropping both bombs together?
Definitely no for the first one, because the height was judged by the pilot by eye, and the navigator was busy doing the range thing with the bomb sight, so they couldn't have flown at the correct height to do it at night. I suppose they could have put the spotlight altimeters in that they had on the Lancasters, etc. But that wasn't really the game, I don't think. There is, I can definitely put my finger on 2 drops in Loch Striven where they dropped the 2 bombs. There's also some footage of unknown provenance, as I suppose they would say, of a squadron of mosquitoes flying low over the sea, and multiple planes drop several bombs. I can't remember if there's more than one off each plane. My belief is that is in a bay near to Skitton in Caithness. I'm not sure of that, but I think that's where that comes from. About 2 years ago, I went on we had a sort of mini holiday in Inverness, and we went for a day to Orkney. So you get a bus up to Thurso and get a ferry across to Orkney and see all the stuff in Orkney and come back again. And while we were driving just north of Wick, there's various isolated houses at the side of the road, and one of them had a big rusty ball in the front garden. And I thought, that cannot possibly be a Highball, can it? But we were like 2 miles away from Skitton, where they were based. So on the way back, I sat with my camera poised to get a picture of this thing. And thanks to the joys of Google Earth, I was able to identify the house, and discovered it was the manse for the local church. So I contacted them. They put me in touch with the owner, and he took some photographs of it. But it was actually a fishing float. It was too small. It was only about 18 inches. He sent me a picture of his cat sitting on the top of it. But I thought that would be terrible. I went to all that trouble to get one out of Loch Striven, and somebody's got one in their front garden.
Can I just ask a quick supplementary question? You've mentioned the Mosquito Museum. You actually talked about the de Havilland Museum at Salisbury Farm.
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
Sorry, yes, it has those 2 names. It was the Mosquito Museum, and then it became the de Havilland Museum, I think.
Well, when I went 2 years ago, they had 3 mosquitoes in the hangar, and one they were trying to get it flyable again. There you are, Brian, a job for you.
Would be a nice one, wouldn't it? Yeah. I think, are we out of questions there, Mike? Because Ian's been very, very patient and good with us tonight. I think it's been an amazing talk. Are there any more before we round up?
Well, thank you to the person who posted in the chat about the label on the one outside, the Upkeep outside Scampton. Yeah, the Upkeep was actually tested over land as well, at the bombing range in the New Forest. So that's where that casing has actually come from. When they were doing that testing, one of the Lancasters flew into the ground. I think certainly some of the crew were killed, not all of them, but there was a Lancaster crash in the New Forest when they were testing the Upkeep on land. So thanks for that comment there. Didn't know that.
Okay. I think we probably wound up, but Ian, if I could just say thank you. My knowledge of highballs, being a typical RAF pilot, were reserved to being in the bar on a Friday night, but you've certainly illuminated us on a very small section of the RAF specialist work and on Barn Wallace's contribution to it. So we do thank you enormously for doing that. It's a fascinating story. I've learned an enormous amount, and I'm sure everybody else has too. So from our disparate group down here in Lancashire of tri-service and civil, heaven knows, did I say civil service? People, but and academics, we're fascinated by subjects of this nature. So thank you to you. Thank Professor Bradley for putting you our way, because that's been a tremendous contact. And who knows, we might hear from you again. I know I'm going to listen to the talk again when Mike sends it round on the link. So thank you for agreeing to having it recorded as well.
Yep, no worries.
Thank you ever so much, and the usual appreciation, folks. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ian.
And thanks to Mike for organising.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. See you Tuesday.
Bye, everyone.